G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're looking at the race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Mexican Grand Prix this coming weekend. As always, if you're new around here, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. So let's get straight into it. Chip usage, always a talking point every single race weekend. Off the back of a sprint race weekend at Circuit of the Americas, now into a non-sprint race weekend in Mexico. A lot of people use Limitless at that sprint race weekend, myself included. Obviously a very optimal time to do that with more points on offer. However, with Limitless at a non-sprint race weekend, not something I would necessarily advise just because of the lower point ceiling that's typically available to strategists. The one exception I would make, however, is if you've got the extra DRS boost and the Limitless still available. Now, in those particular circumstances, I would save the extra DRS boost for the last remaining sprint race in Interlagos next race weekend. Limitless, I would use at potentially Mexico or Las Vegas or Abu Dhabi, only because I guess there isn't another sprint race to use it at firstly, but secondly, we saw some people deploy it very effectively at Monza when Ferrari and Mercedes were very, very strong in the practice sessions. Now, if we see something similar in Mexico, then perhaps consider using it here. You could also save it for Vegas, where we haven't raced at before, a lot of variables there, or Abu Dhabi, which is probably a much easier track to race at than Vegas. But just wait for a time if you've got both of these available and you want to use Limitless, where you see Mercedes, those more expensive assets, Mercedes constructor, Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc, all driving really well. Obviously, they were doing that in the US Grand Prix, so who knows? They could probably replicate that performance in Mexico. As for autopilot, Verstappen, Hamilton, Norris are all top of the list when it comes to point scoring fantasy assets this race weekend. Now, I think there is going to be one particular build, which I'll show you later in the video, which accommodates all three of these drivers, all very consistent, all have the potential to outscore the others this or on any other given race weekend. I think that's when autopilot enters the conversation, when there's a little bit of uncertainty as to who you think could be the top scoring driver in your team. Then consider using it there. Now, for me to get Hamilton in, it would take a -4. That would preclude me from using autopilot, as I'd most likely end up using wildcard. But again, if you do think you've got 2 or 3 potential race winners or top fantasy scorers in your team for that weekend, just throw the autopilot on if you've still got it in your pocket, which for me, I do. As for the other chips, extra DRS boost is not a chip I would ordinarily advise. It is the most powerful chip in the game and is most effectively used at sprint race weekends. Save it for Interlagos if you've still got it. As I said, if you've got Limitless and extra DRS, then save the extra DRS for Interlagos, save the Limitless for, say, this weekend, or use it this weekend, save it for Abu Dhabi, for instance. Wildcard, final fix, team dependent. Now, if you're taking a -4 or a -8, which I may well end up doing this weekend to get Lewis Hamilton into my team, then I'm just going to pull trigger on the wildcard. A lot of us have sat on that chip for so many races already because of how easy it is to take a -4 to get that extra trade, that extra driver into your team. Now, we could see many people go the entire season without using without using the wild card chip because of how small that -4 is to get in a new driver. -4 over the course of a full weekend, 300, 400 points most weeks our teams are scoring. That's 1, 2, 3% of your total team score. But as we've only got very few races left in the calendar, the hits are probably have less time to pay off over multiple races. I just use it now. There's probably not going to be too many more opportunities to use it, unless of course you want to just go full differential in that last week in Abu Dhabi, go out all differentials, hope Max has a DNF, Red Bull has a DNF type thing. And then final fix, as with every race, team dependent. Just make sure if you're going to use that chip, you have enough budget to move to a more expensive driver if the one you're taking out is, I guess, expected to qualify well and not do so much in the race. But again, you can't use it on a constructor. So just think about if you do want to use it, when you could potentially use it. It is hard to predict, hard to forecast. So just wait for the optimal time to use that. I use mine in Monaco. So thankfully, don't need to worry about that at all. As for no negative, so that chip I used in Singapore, it was a street circuit. There was obviously very little risk of rain there, but I was just conscious of the fact that it is a much narrower street circuit to navigate. Now, last night, as I do with most races, I played through Mexico on my PlayStation to give myself, I guess, a bit more of a feel for the racetrack. And I did, after doing that, play Las Vegas as well. Now, I hadn't really seen what the circuit had looked like before I played it on there. And so I was quite surprised by how narrow some of these sectors of the circuit are. It reminded me a lot of Singapore. And, you know, obviously when I used it there, it didn't really spell any points or save points for me. But Las Vegas exhibited some track characteristics that I thought were representative of Singapore, of Saudi Arabia. So I would certainly save it for Las Vegas. Just throw it on your team. We've never raced there before, so there's an inherent risk of lack of familiarity with the circuit among all drivers. I don't think the simulator does it quite justice. So just think about that heading into that race. You could just use it there if you haven't already. I imagine most people have used their chips already, but if you've been sitting on the no negative, I think Las Vegas becomes a very good time to use it. If we go into the key talking points for the weekend, bounce back weekends for Hamilton and Leclerc after their disqualifications in Circuit of the Americas. Lewis is obviously reeling from another DNF in Qatar, so I think he's going to be hungry to score some points to get back on the podium. He's never gone in his entire career back-to-back races without a points finish, so I fully expect he's going to be in the mix for points, for even a podium. The Mercedes is looking really competitive, has done through the last kind of few races or so, and as one of the most consistent fantasy assets in the game right now, I'm looking at getting him into my team this race weekend. Leclerc, I think, a great option too, but I'm just not sure that the value for money is quite there. We've seen Sainz being able to match his output, his production so far this season, for the most part anyway. And unless you're on Limitless, I'm just not sure I can make the case to get him into my team. There's also reports of the fact that Ferrari are getting to the limit of their power units. I think that's, or turbochargers, one of the two. They're about to exceed a key component of the car. The limit we get, I think, is 4 per season. And if Leclerc doesn't take a penalty for that this week, that could run a risk in terms of his ability to finish the race. He could exceed, I guess, the capacity of the engine or whatever the part it is that's in question. And if he does end up taking that penalty in Brazil for that new power unit, then it perhaps comes with some degree of risk that he may have, an issue with the reliability of his car. So again, I'm not going to speculate too much, but the fact that the reports came out at the time of recording, this is early Friday morning, that Leclerc may not be taking a penalty this weekend in Mexico makes me a little hesitant to jump in on him as an asset to own, regardless of how I think he's expected to perform in practice. Talking of practice, there are more practice sessions this weekend, so something we just haven't had for a number of weeks now. I think coming into a non-sprint weekend provides a little bit more of consistency and reliability in terms of the data we're presented with heading into the weekend and building our team out. Something to just keep in mind, however, is obviously that just about half the grid are running reserve drivers in FP1. Mercedes, Alpine, AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo, and Haas are all going to provide opportunities for their reserve rookie drivers to, have 60 minutes behind the wheel. Also, the fact is that we are looking at different tyre compounds. So I think FP1 is going to be pretty much a write-off. I know Hamilton is not going to, provide his seat to Vesti. That's instead going to George Russell's car. But I think with the new tyre compounds, which I'll talk to in a minute, these rookie drivers taking the seats of all of a lot of these teams, keeping in mind that, Alpine isn't really in the conversation for template fantasy assets, and then in AlphaTauri, maybe Tsunoda, Joe for Alfa Romeo, maybe Nico Hülkenberg for Haas. But for the most part, I'm not too concerned if FP1 doesn't really give us a lot of information. I think the tyre compounds is what's more interesting to me. And Pirelli have provided a softer tyre compound in Mexico to all teams to try out in practice, FP1 and FP2, partly because of the fact that this circuit doesn't have a high rate of degradation on the tyres. And when you combine that with obviously the rarefied air reducing drag, which has been called out by Racing 365 in this article, and even though cars are likely to run a high downforce setup, that doesn't necessarily translate to a high level of tire degradation for the cars heading into the weekend. We saw last year a lot of cars only ran one-stop strategies as a result of that, so we may see drivers run a stint on the medium and a stint on the soft. But again, we'll see how practice shakes out. I'm not really so sure that FP1 is going to really give us a lot of useful information. As far as FP2, yes, they're going to be trialing these new tire compounds. So we may only really see a true representation of car performance, tire performance in FP3. Again, one practice session of true data. We've seen that the last 2 weeks in sprint race weekends. So who knows? We could really have another kind of mixed bag of results in practice. If we go on to the next point, McLaren. Interesting to me, there were reports that came out earlier this week that they're quite pessimistic on what the car is expected to do at Mexico. Something to keep in mind, though, is that they had the same sentiment heading into the US Grand Prix, yet Lando Norris still finished P2, keeping in mind, obviously, that was from Lewis's disqualification. And Oscar looked really good until his DNF in that race, in the first half of that race. So I've got this article from Speed Cafe, came out, I think it was today, actually. Yeah, Friday. Oscar is quite unsure about how the McLaren is going to perform. Now, they've obviously made great progress with that car over the last kind of second half of this season or so, but there are some very mixed track characteristics. Mexico, somewhat of a high-speed circuit. You've got these massive straights. One of the longest straights is the pit straight. Through sector 1 is another straight right after that. But then you've got some really slow speed corners through sectors 2 and 3, particularly through that grandstand section heading back into the starting grid area. So I would just keep in mind that given how many varying kind of components to this circuit there are, we could see a lot of very mixed results in practice. There's some options I'm thinking about where it's a McLaren-less team holding onto the constructor, obviously, because I think it's exceptional value for money. But at the same time, if we do see Piastri and Norris off the pace, I think that opens the door for a few different combinations we could use this weekend. So just keep that in mind, because I know they sandbagged a little bit in the US Grand Prix. They still they had a really good performance. You never know. Oscar could be saying the same thing here, where he's just expecting McLaren to struggle a little bit, and then who knows, they come through, smash it, P2, P3 like they did a few weeks ago. So interesting, obviously, point of view there, but notwithstanding that, just something to keep in mind. And then obviously pointed out the high downforce setups, even though that doesn't necessarily translate to a higher level of degradation. High altitude, another variable just to keep in mind with those practice times, what that could look like for car performance across the board for all teams. So lots of really interesting talking points to think about heading into practice on the Friday and on the Saturday. The last thing I want to look at is my team selection. I know I've covered this already in my team selection video. Check that out if you haven't done so already. But there are a lot of different combinations I'm thinking about heading into this weekend. This was the team I had in Qatar, used Limitless at the US Grand Prix. Not so sure yet if I still run with that. I talked about Lewis Hamilton earlier, and I think that certainly becomes an option given his level of consistency we've seen from him this season. So for me, if I wanted this, or if I wanted Lewis particularly in my team, I would need to get the budget enabler at the moment, Daniel Ricciardo, but also downgrade Oscar Piastri. I think it's hard to part ways with Lando Norris based on that consistency, but again, if practice reveals otherwise, I may not end up going with Lando at all either. I think Daniel is exceptionally good value for money at $4.5 million. He's got a lot of upside. All he needs is one double-digit haul, and his price will most likely go up $0.5 million. So I think he's a bit of a cash cow in terms of a fantasy asset to own. That leaves me with $11 million, which is just enough to squeeze in Alex Albon. Again, I've loved Albon's consistency this entire season. He's really looked good in that Williams, and I fully expect that to continue. I think the Williams will be exceptionally well in Sector 1 with those two straights I talked about. Wouldn't be surprised if we see him throw in a purple sector here and there in practice, or maybe even in qualifying. So I think for me, really like this build. It also gives me Lewis in the lead up to Interlagos. I definitely think with Mercedes having won 6 of the last 8 races, they're typically a very good kind of stronghold for them. I would love to have him heading into the next race too. The problem with me is that I've only got 0.2 million in my team. So if any of these guys go up and I don't have them this weekend, it becomes very difficult to get them back in next weekend. I think for me, the obvious move would be to get Joe instead of Albon, but I just think I much prefer Albon's kind of overall consistency. And Joe has been consistent this season, don't get me wrong, but I think Albon has a slightly higher fantasy upside than Joe, and I think that's reflected very much in his price and his performances we've seen so far. Again, I talked about earlier about McLaren's potential concerns at this circuit. Now, I'm not so sure if, again, those are going to be completely true, but at the same time, if we do see Lando and Oscar Piastri struggle through the practice sessions, then I think I could go driverless. I think it's hard to part ways. Don't even think about parting ways with Red Bull, to be quite honest with you. Perez, I know I talked about him in my team selection video, and he's still very much on the radar for me. But all he needs to do is finish a race. Max's likelihood of winning is a foregone conclusion right now. So I think Red Bull is far and away the best constructor to own. McLaren, on the other hand, I think there's still exceptional value for money there. Like, if we quickly jump over to F1 Fantasy Tools, McLaren have been a top 2, top 3 constructor scorer in terms of points just about every week for the last kind of half dozen or so races. You throw in the fact that they've got an excellent pit stop performance, so I feel like that's bonus points right there for them. And even if Ferrari and Mercedes are outscoring them by, 10, 15 points most weeks, I'm just not sure that's enough of a case to be made for me to want to move away from them. You can certainly pivot to a Red Bull and either a Ferrari or Mercedes constructed double up, but I'm just not so sure that they're offering the same value when their points production is, on par or close to what McLaren are churning through every single week. So again, don't let me tell you otherwise if you feel strongly about, a powerhouse cup power up on the constructors, but I think McLaren, if Oscar and Lando are still finishing inside the top 10, top 7, I think that's pretty good fantasy output right there. So if I decide to, if I think Perez or George Russell are looking very good in practice, then I could potentially double up on Mercedes here, get in Joe in this final slot. That I think gives me just enough to jump up to Perez too. So, if I'm liking the look of, Mercedes or Red Bull, I have the flexibility to get in these guys here. For me, that almost definitely necessitates a wild card. I'm taking a -8. So it would stop me from using autopilot, which I would love to use either this race, maybe Las Vegas, maybe Abu Dhabi. Not so sure if it's Interlagos, unless I think Lewis is a sure thing to come through the field and blow them out of the water. But right now, I really like this build. I've got Max, Red Bull, McLaren, all assets, I don't think, and Lewis, which I think ultimately will stay in my team for the rest of the season once I get him in. And then Ricciardo, who's an excellent budget enabler too. So it wouldn't really need many more hits after this weekend once I use wildcard if I decided to move out Perez and Joe for other assets. So I'm kind of really liking how this is shaping up. Again, waiting for practice times to reveal where my head's finally at. But I think getting in Lewis for me is pretty much the focal point, given I expect a very strong bounce back performance in Mexico, and I expect a sensational kind of sprint weekend for him in Brazil after 2 very disappointing sprint weekends in Qatar and the US Grand Prix. But guys, I think I'll leave it there for now. As always, if you're enjoying the content, you're liking what you're seeing, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It goes a very long way to helping me and this channel grow. I will be on X, Twitter, whatever we want to call it, in the lead up to the deadline. And I'm back for a deadline stream on FanAmp with Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ 1 hour before qualifying tomorrow. So drop by. We can answer all of your burning questions live on stream. And obviously we've got prizes and giveaways. So all the details for joining the stream, joining FanAmp, and all of those, entering those prizes and giveaways are in the details in the description below. But I'm going to leave it there. As I pointed out, guys, I appreciate you dropping by. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I'll see you all very soon.